A referendum on British membership of the European Union is at least a year away, but the debate on the pros and cons is in full swing. Janan Ganesh, good to have you back again. You wrote a very interesting column this week about Britain, the European Union, and the euro. And more than 10 years ago, there was a big debate about British membership. You believe that should be linked to a future referendum and the terms of membership.
Yeah, because the campaign over whether we should stay in the European Union will be influenced in voters' minds by the position that people took 10 to 15 years ago about whether we should have joined the euro. And there are lots of people on the pro-European side now who were pro-euro at the tail end of the 90s, as recently as sort of 2003. And they will lack credibility in the EU referendum campaign until such time as they acknowledge that it was a mistake, an intellectual mistake, and that the consequences of the currency union, designed in its current form, have been awful for millions of people along the periphery of Europe. And I don't detect enough contrition or self-awareness about that position they took all those years ago.
Of course, this takes place against a backdrop of a serious crisis in Greece, still unresolved. Do you believe that the problem was that proponents of joining the euro argued purely in political rather than economic terms?
I think that was the exact nature of the problem, that they were so committed to the idea or the ideal of European integration, a political project, that they thought it could override any practical objections or economic obstacles. And that's why they were kind of almost impatient and brusque with anyone who was raising economic objections.
And you'd be talking about Tony Blair, wouldn't you?
Tony Blair was the classic example, actually, as Prime Minister at that period. And the person offering the economic case against was his own Chancellor, Gordon Brown, advised by Ed Balls, who I mentioned in the column, who was arguing against Euro monetarism, as he called it, as far back as 1992. So there were plenty of people willing to make the practical, hard-headed argument. But people who were almost ideologically committed to European unity didn't take them seriously, and they should acknowledge, I think, now that it was a mistake not to.
We'll come to the Financial Times position in a minute, Janan, but Ed Balls, interestingly, lost his seat in the recent election, Shadow Chancellor and top aide to Gordon Brown, and probably one of the architects, along with Mr. Brown, of the so-called 5 tests for membership of whether that Britain would have to pass in order to be eligible, in effect, on economic grounds for monetary union.
Yeah, and those 5 tests were famously knocked up in the back of a car when they had to spontaneously come up with reasons as to why Britain shouldn't join. So the tests themselves were pretty spurious and superficial, but underlying it was a lot of heavy thinking that Ed Balls had done when he himself was a Financial Times journalist in the early 1990s. I think the public are pretty reasonable about this, and they will not assume that the euro question and the EU question are identical. They will know that you can be anti-euro and pro-EU, which is what I still think the result will end up being in the referendum. But I think it depends on hearing from the pro-EU side a little bit of self-awareness, and that goes a long way in a country which, by mid-term, when the referendum takes place, is going to be in a pretty anti-establishment, anti-elite kind of mood.
So just for the record, the Financial Times did indeed, and still supports the euro in principle, though it regards the project as somewhat flawed in economic terms, and there needed to be adjustments in the architecture, etc. Regarding British membership, I think it's fair to say around that time, 15 years ago, we were broadly in favour as an aspiration, but sort of said, well, the tests need to be applied. I think that position somewhat refined in the last few years, where we basically said it doesn't work for Britain and won't work for Britain. But let's just come forward now to the debate on membership of the European Union for Britain. Do you think the no's at the moment have got the momentum?
I think they've gained a bit of momentum recently. A few months ago, it looked like the Yes campaign, the pro-staying-in campaign, had all the momentum because they'd signed up big businesses and they had a big lead in the opinion polls. But more recently, the No campaign have been good at rallying maybe smaller businesses, non-exporting businesses, in favour of at least a very severe renegotiation of our membership and possibly even contemplating exit. So the gap in the energy and credibility of the two campaigns has narrowed. And I think what the real test in the referendum campaign will be interventions from foreign governments, because the No campaign's entire argument hinges on the fact that if we leave the EU, Australia, China, America, India, Japan will be queuing up to do business with us, trade deals with us, have diplomatic relations with us. I'm not sure that's true. Talking to diplomats from those countries over the past 2 years, I'm pretty confident it's not true. And if they make interventions into the debate, then your average British voter will think, actually, the future for us outside the EU is not quite as safe as the No campaign are arguing, and they might stick rather than twist.
So I'm going to put you on the spot, Janan. If you had to give a quick soundbite or two for the Yes campaign, what would you say the 2 key messages would be? What's the strongest card they've got to play?
The first would be the foreign governments. Try and get the Americans and the Japanese to make subtle diplomatic interventions. Mm-hmm. But the main one can be summarized in 2 words: say sorry.
Well, I'm not going to apologize just yet, but great talking to you. Thanks, Janan.
Thank you.